Most toxic relationships do not begin with someone thinking, I would like to become controlling. They begin with a story the person tells themselves. I just want this to work. I believe in us. I know them better than they know themselves. That last sentence is the tell. Because what they're actually doing is responding to the relationship they need to exist, not the one in front of them. Late night silence becomes proof of longing. A half-hearted apology becomes proof of change. A clear pattern of contempt becomes they're afraid of intimacy. And then the behavior follows the fantasy. They push harder. They check more. They demand more reassurance. They apply more pressure. The result? They create exactly what they feared. They wanted closeness and produced suffocation. They wanted honesty and produced performance. They wanted love and produced exhaustion. This is not just bad luck. The intention was distorted from the start because it was never really about the other person. It was about the outcome they needed. A good intention built on self-deception is not really good. It is just convenient. That is the gap that this episode is about. The difference between what an intention feels like and what it actually does in the world. We make this mistake everywhere, in relationships, in politics, in everyday life. Take certain left-wing organizations that claim to defend women's rights. Genuine feminism is straightforward. Women's rights matter, always, for all women. But what some of these groups practice is something different. They use women's rights as leverage. It is a moral instrument they pick up when it is politically useful and put down when it is not. Violence against women is condemned loudly when the perpetrator fits the expected villain in the political story. But when the perpetrator belongs to a group that left-wing politics has coded as a victim group, a minority, a non-Western community, an ideologically inconvenient category, the language changes fast. Suddenly, there is context to consider. Suddenly, the same organizations that speak in absolutes about women's safety start doing very careful arithmetic about which victims to platform. We saw versions of this in weak or delayed responses to ISIS sexual slavery of Yazidi women and girls. We saw it after October 7th, when some institutions that usually speak quickly about sexual violence became slow, cautious, or evasive when the victims were Israeli women. And we saw a structurally similar failure in the UK grooming gang scandals, where fear of appearing racist contributed to institutional failures to confront abuse properly. This does not mean every person who hesitated had consciously bad motives. People are very good at telling themselves flattering stories about why they believe what they believe. But it does mean that reality diverged from the stated intention. If your defense of women depends on whether the attacker is politically convenient, then protecting women's rights is not actually your main principle. Loyalty to political narrative is. Now zoom back to something most of you have probably done. Imagine someone who gives every restaurant and every driver a 5-star review because they don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. The food arrives cold, 5 stars. The driver takes the wrong route and doesn't apologize, 5 stars. The intention is kindness. But what does it actually produce? A rating system that tells nobody anything. The excellent restaurant and the careless one look identical. The safe driver and the dangerous one are indistinguishable. The next person opens the app, trusts the rating, and gets misled. The reviewer wanted to avoid harm. They produced it just for someone else. Same structure, intention disconnected from reality. Now scale it up one more time. Give it a political movement, a party, a state. The consequences multiply accordingly. Let's talk about socialism and communism. What is the actual intention behind these ideologies? The ideological vocabulary sounds appealing. Equality, solidarity, fairness, an end to exploitation, a society where no one is left behind. Those are emotionally powerful claims. But let's look at the logic underneath. If your goal is to make people equal, not to protect equal rights, but to engineer equal outcomes, you immediately have a problem. People are different. They have different skills, ambitions, choices, and values. Some will produce more, some will want different things. To force equal outcomes on people who make unequal choices, you need to override those choices. That means controlling what they can own, what jobs they can take, how much they can earn, where they can live, what they can say. That is not a side effect. It is a built-in conceptual flaw. The moment you commit to engineering equality rather than protecting liberty, you're already on the road to a dictatorship. Not because of bad luck or bad leaders, but because the idea itself requires it. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is visible in every large-scale attempt to implement these ideologies. Across the 20th century, socialist and communist regimes produced the same pattern regardless of country, decade, or leader. Political repression, censorship, one-party rule, restrictions on movement, forced collectivization, labor camps, artificial famines, mass surveillance, chronic shortages, and mass death. The exact toll is debated because historians count categories differently, but the total runs into the tens of millions. And the damage is not only measured in deaths. These systems also destroy the mechanisms that allow societies to detect and correct failure. Free press, opposition parties, independent courts, private enterprise, freedom of speech. When you cannot criticize policy, publish evidence, organize opposition, or vote leaders out, failure becomes invisible. And invisible failure cannot be fixed. The standard defense is communism is the end goal and these are just problems that are temporary, or the implementation was wrong. At some point, this stops being an argument and starts being a liturgy. After the same pattern is repeated across the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, Cuba, Venezuela, Cambodia, and North Korea, the claim that it is always the implementation and never the ideology requires motivated blindness on an impressive scale. Even if people were unable to understand the conceptual flaws, there is a moment where the evidence is available. Especially in today's information age, it is freely and abundantly available. A person who looks at the evidence and still clings to the intention, who still says, but the idea is beautiful, is no longer being idealistic. They're choosing to ignore consequences, which means they're now part of the cause of those consequences. You do not get to keep the moral credit for your vision while ignoring what the vision produces. That is not idealism. That is vanity at other people's expense. So we have established one direction. Bad outcomes do not get pardoned by a claim of good intentions. But the rule has to cut both ways. We should also not ignore good outcomes because we dislike the people, institutions, or industries that produce them and question their intentions. This is where people become even more uncomfortable. It is easier to say they mean well, so forgive the outcome. It is much harder to say, I think they have bad motives. I dislike their image. I may even dislike their culture, but the results are better than I assumed. Genetically modified crops are a good example. GMOs are routinely portrayed as the result of corporate greed and associated with farmer dependency, seed market monopolies, the destruction of biodiversity, and generally suspect because they're artificially created. Let's leave aside the fact that genetic modification is just a more targeted version of breeding, which has been practiced for thousands of years. In terms of results, the reality does not match the prejudices. A 2014 meta-analysis of 147 studies found that, on average, GM crop adoption reduced chemical pesticide use by 37%, increased crop yields by 22%, and increased farmer profits by 68%. The gains were especially strong in developing countries, and these outcomes should carry the most weight. However, critics tend to get stuck on the bad outcomes which support the hypothesis of a bad motive. A related example is Sri Lanka's 2021 fertilizer and pesticide ban. The government abruptly banned imports of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, aiming to transition the country toward fully organic agriculture. The stated goals were environmental protection, public health, and freedom from chemical dependency. Those sound like admirable goals, but the policy was not honestly checked against agricultural reality. The sudden ban created serious agricultural disruption. The intention sounded clean. The rejected technology sounded dirty. But the outcome told a different story. Reality does not care which side has better branding. Another controversial example is nuclear energy. It has been systematically portrayed as uniquely dangerous. Invisible radiation, catastrophic accident, an industry indifferent to human life. People often assume the nuclear industry must be hiding something sinister and overfocus on risks. The fear is emotionally understandable, but doesn't stand up to reality. Because when deaths are compared by unit of electricity produced, fossil fuels, especially coal and oil, are far deadlier than nuclear, largely because of air pollution. Nuclear is among the lowest death energy sources in the same broad range as wind and solar. That includes the major accidents people remember. Germany is an important case. After Fukushima, an incident that caused 0 deaths from radiation, Germany accelerated its nuclear phase-out. Politically and emotionally, the decision felt responsible. It sounded aligned with safety, caution, and environmental seriousness. But when nuclear capacity was replaced partly with fossil fuels, especially coal, the outcome became more complicated. One widely cited estimate from researchers at Carnegie Mellon found that Germany's nuclear phase-out created roughly 1,100 excess deaths per year from air pollution linked to increased fossil fuel use, while also increasing social costs by around $12 billion per year in the initial years. That does not mean nuclear has no problems. It has cost issues, waste issues, build time issues, political issues, and security concerns. But the simplistic moral picture is wrong. The energy source that feels most dangerous has one of the safest records, and the decision that felt most responsible may have produced more deaths. Again, an assumed bad intention is not able to predict the actual result. At larger scale, the same mistake happens with capitalism. Capitalism is regularly portrayed as greed institutionalized, exploitation as a system, inequality as a feature, human beings reduced to labor units and consumption machines. That portrayal did not emerge from neutral observation. It is a moral image the left has spent decades constructing. And it lands emotionally. Greed is ugly. Corporate power is often ugly. But the question is not whether the image lands. The question is whether it is accurate. So let's look at capitalism's actual track record. For most of human history, living standards changed little from one generation to the next. Then, with the rise of markets, trade, technological innovation, and stronger institutions, GDP per person began to rise dramatically across much of the world. And the outcome was not just more money for the rich. It was a massive expansion in productivity, income, medicine, education, and everyday comfort for hundreds of millions of people. And this is where the contrast with left-wing ideology matters. Systems built on explicit moral commitments to equality and justice repeatedly did the opposite, concentrated power, suppressed dissent, and produced stagnation and mass suffering. While market-based economies have been associated with the largest reduction in extreme poverty in human history. If you want a controlled experiment, history provided two. Germany was divided after World War II. Same people, same culture, same starting point. West Germany adopted the market economy. East Germany adopted central planning. By 1989, West Germans were roughly 2.5 times richer. When the wall came down, East Germans left by the millions. Korea is even more striking. In 1970, North Korea was actually richer than South Korea on a per capita basis. Then the trajectories separated. By the early 2020s, South Korea's GDP per capita was roughly 55 times that of the North. Not 55% more, 55 times more. But the gap wasn't only income. East Germans couldn't leave without risking their lives. The wall was built to keep them in, not to keep others out. North Koreans still can't leave. That is not a side effect. That is the system working as designed. A system built around controlling outcomes has to control the people producing them. Same starting conditions, different systems. Capitalism does not love you. Markets do not wake up thinking about human dignity. They run on people's incentives. But if a system with ugly branding produces better outcomes than a system with beautiful slogans, then the outcomes matter more. And people do not live inside slogans, they live inside consequences. So what do we do with all of this? Stop treating any intention as the end of the moral conversation. What counts is the result it produced. This is not a cold way to think. It is a more compassionate way to think. Because people suffer from outcomes, not intentions. An intention that is not also interested in results is not really a good intention. It is an ideology. And if you're not checking your idea against reality, you're not trying to help anyone. You're trying to be right. Those are different projects. There is a point of no return. At some moment, different for every issue, but always reachable, the evidence becomes clear. At that point, the person who still clings to the intention, who still says, but the idea is right, has crossed the line. The intention is no longer innocent. It has become a choice to ignore consequences, which means the person now shares responsibility for them. So the next time someone says, but they had good intentions, the answer is simple. Fine. Now show me the results.